Seneca was one of the richest men in the Roman Empire and personal advisor to an emperor. And yet he wrote, again and again, that most people never live their own lives at all, they merely exist inside lives chosen for them by others. That includes, he suspected, himself. If you have ever felt busy without purpose, successful without satisfaction, or driven by goals you cannot quite remember choosing, then Seneca was describing you nearly 2,000 years before you were born. In this video we will examine 4 precise signs, drawn from his letters and essays, that reveal when a life has quietly stopped being your own. If the Stoics' approach resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. In his essay on the shortness of life, written around 49 AD, Seneca put it bluntly, people are frugal with their property, but the moment it comes to wasting time, they are most wasteful of the one thing it is right to be greedy about. The first and most fundamental sign appears in how you treat your time, because time, for Seneca, is the only currency that truly belongs to you. In On the Shortness of Life he argues that we are not given a short life but that we make it short, squandering it on tasks and people that contribute nothing to who we are. This is why a man can be relentlessly busy his entire life and still arrive at death having never lived, for activity is not the same as living. What this reveals is a strange contradiction in human behavior. We defend our money and our property with fierce attention, refusing to let others take what is ours, and yet we hand our days away to anyone who asks, allowing every demand and distraction to claim the hours we will never recover. Seneca writes that no one will give back the years, no one will restore you to yourself. The first sign, therefore, is that your calendar is full but your choices are absent. You are responding, reacting, fulfilling obligations you never deliberately accepted, and your time flows outward toward goals that belong to other people. But this raises a harder question that Seneca pursued relentlessly: if our time is borrowed, what about the very fears that drive how we spend it? The second sign is subtler, because it hides inside the emotions you assume are entirely your own. Seneca observed that the majority of our fears are inherited rather than chosen, absorbed from the crowd, from family, from the anxieties of our age. In his letters to Lucilius he writes that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, and that there are more things likely to frighten us than to actually harm us. What this means is that a borrowed fear functions exactly like a borrowed master: it dictates your decisions, narrows your possibilities, and yet you never consented to its rule. You fear losing status because those around you fear it. You dread financial ruin in the same shape and intensity as your neighbors, never pausing to ask whether your dread is proportionate or even truly yours. Seneca's remedy was the discipline of examination, to take each fear and trace it to its source, asking whether it describes a real danger or merely an echo of other people's panic. He counsels Lucilius to rehearse misfortune in advance, not to torment himself, but to discover that most dreaded outcomes are survivable and many are imaginary. When you examine a fear honestly, you often find it was never your own. But if our fears are borrowed and our time is spent, Seneca pointed to something deeper still, a way of living that postpones life itself. The third sign is the habit of perpetual postponement, of treating the present as a mere corridor towards some future arrival that never comes. Seneca diagnosed this with surgical precision when he wrote that the greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today. The man living someone else's life is forever preparing, forever waiting until the promotion, the retirement, the moment when his real life will finally begin. This is why such a person arranges everything for a future that, by definition, remains permanently out of reach, because each tomorrow he reaches becomes another today he refuses to inhabit. Seneca puts it sharply in his essay, "While we are postponing, life speeds by." What this reveals is that a borrowed life is almost always a deferred life, lived in the conditional tense, structured around goals that belong to a self that does not yet exist and may never exist. The Stoic correction is not to abandon planning, but to recognize that the only territory you actually possess is the present. Seneca tells Lucilius to lay hold of today's task, so that he will depend less on tomorrow. To live now, deliberately and fully, is itself an act of reclaiming the life that postponement quietly steals. And yet there is a fourth sign, one that explains why the other three persist so stubbornly: the presence of the crowd inside your own mind. The fourth and most revealing sign is that your decisions are made by a crowd you cannot see, an internalized chorus of opinion that you mistake for your own judgment. Seneca warned Lucilius repeatedly against this, writing that nothing is so damaging to good character as the habit of lounging at public spectacles, because vices steal into us through the avenue of pleasure and the influence of the many. To mingle constantly with the crowd, he argued, is to return home greedier, more ambitious, more anxious, to absorb the values of everyone and the convictions of no one. This is why the borrowed life so often feels invisible to the person living it, because the borrowing happens beneath awareness, in the steady accumulation of opinions and appetites that the multitude regards as obvious. What this means is that you can pursue wealth, recognition, and approval with complete sincerity while never once examining whether you actually wanted those things or simply caught them from the people around you. Seneca's instruction is to withdraw into yourself as much as you can, to associate with those who will make you better, and to measure your life by the verdict of reason rather than the applause of the crowd. The cure begins the moment you notice that a desire arrived from outside. To ask whose voice is speaking when you decide is to begin the slow work of taking your life back. This brings us to what Seneca finally prescribed. Having diagnosed the borrowed life, Seneca offered not a feeling but a practice, because the recovery of one's own life is the work of attention, repeated daily. The most practically applicable instrument he left us is the evening review, described in his essay on anger, where he recounts how each night he summoned his whole day before his eyes, examining his words and deeds, hiding nothing and excusing nothing. This is why the Stoic remedy is not retreat from the world but a disciplined relationship to it, in which you continually distinguish what is genuinely yours from what the world has lent you without asking. What this practice produces is ownership of your time, because you now spend it deliberately, of your fears, because you have traced them to their source, of your present, because you have stopped deferring it, and of your decisions, because you have silenced the crowd long enough to hear yourself. Seneca insisted that this is not a matter of grand gestures but of small, consistent acts of self-possession, available to anyone regardless of wealth or station, just as it was available to him, a man surrounded by imperial luxury and yet capable of writing as a free soul. The borrowed life ends not in a single dramatic break but in the quiet, repeated decision to ask, each day, whether the life you are living is actually your own. That question, honestly answered, is the beginning of freedom. Seneca's four signs converge on a single truth: a life can be full, busy, and admired by others while never once belonging to the person living it, because time spent without choosing, fears never examined, a present endlessly postponed, and decisions made by an unseen crowd are the precise mechanisms by which a life becomes borrowed. The practical implication is uncomfortable but liberating. The only way to reclaim your life is to examine it daily, asking with honesty whose goals, whose fears, and whose voice are actually steering your days. The Stoics wrote for themselves, but what they left behind survived 2,000 years for a reason. Subscribe and we will keep exploring why.